Let's start with some high-level discussion about functions in JavaScript. Then we'll give very detailed interactive examples of the major JavaScript features. So let's start with some quotes. JavaScript has more in common with functional languages like Lisp or Scheme than with C or Java. Now, I think this is a bit of an exaggeration, and this quote was made before Java 8, when Java 8 started to support functional programming. But nevertheless, the person who made this quote, Doug Crockford, is one of the most respected developers in the JavaScript community. And his point, although perhaps a small amount of hyperbole, is a good one, which is JavaScript is about functional programming. Most other mainstream languages are not primarily about functional programming. Here's another quote from the same person. It, meaning JavaScript, is Lisp in C's clothing. Now, this is a definite exaggeration. I was a Lisp developer before Java existed, but nevertheless, it makes the point that the general programming strategy in JavaScript, like in Lisp, is functional programming, whereas the general programming strategy in many other mainstream languages is object-oriented programming. You want to get good at JavaScript. Well, in most cases, having experience with Java or C# or C++ would be an advantage. Now, most of you listening to, or at least many of you listening to this video series, have no programming background, but some of you have experience with those languages. And with loops and if statements and strings and arrays, experience with those other languages was an advantage. But when you get to this part, functional programming, experience with some of those other languages can actually be a disadvantage because you're so used to thinking in a certain way, it's hard to start thinking in the JavaScript functional programming sort of way. So beginners or programmers who come from more functional-oriented languages like Ruby or Lisp or Scheme or Python do a little bit better than those who come from Java or C++ or C# in this particular aspect. So in JavaScript, functional programming is the primary or the most central programming strategy. In C# and Java and C++, object-oriented programming is the most central programming strategy. Now, several of these languages support both strategies, but nevertheless, in those other languages, object-oriented programming is the central programming strategy, whereas in JavaScript, functional programming is the central programming strategy. So if you try to bring your experience from other languages in and try to primarily do object-oriented programming in JavaScript, you'll be frustrated because object-oriented programming in JavaScript, to be frank, is not very good. But the functional programming is very good. So if you try to do it the same way you did other languages, you'll just be frustrated because JavaScript is not so great at object-oriented programming, but is very good at functional programming. And so learn the functional programming strategy. The way that you program in JavaScript is different than the way that you program in Java or C++ or C#. And again, if you have no experience with the other languages, which many of you don't, no problem, learn functional programming.